HCI, and yes, I've said Azure, not Azure, even though we're in the UK. It is a point of contention, it is an annoyance for me, but I've settled on Azure versus Azure because I've decided that it's a proper noun, it's a name. So Azure is how it should be spoken, and so I will say that. It's not just because I spend so much time with Americans that I say Azure versus Azure. So apologies to the Brits, but that's where we are. I am delivering this session about automating Azure Stack HCI with MSLab and PowerShell on behalf of Jaromir Kaspar. Sadly, Jaromir cannot be here. He fell off a horse, literally, and so wasn't able to attend. So I have jumped in to try and save the day. I will not do as good a session as he would have done, but I will do my absolute best. Before we get going, I need to say thank you to all of the sponsors of Scottish Summit. Without the sponsors, we would not be here. So thank you to Microsoft, thank you to HSO, thank you to Proximo 3, Docs 42, PwC, and AIS as well. And then on to Companion, Cloud Thing, Experian, Incremental, who are local and just down the road, I think. DQ Global, ATEC, Tisky, and Squared Up. And Squared Up I actually know as well. I just poached one of their folks from India into my team, so great company, great people as well. I'm not going to linger too long on myself, number one, because we're running a few minutes behind and we only have a short time to go through this, and number two, because you don't care. But just to give a brief background, I've been in the IT industry for about 20 years. Some of this is contextually relevant, by the way. I'm not just ego inflating here. I've worked in 5 or 6 industries in my time in the IT industry. So I've worked in banking for Royal Bank of Scotland. I've worked in newspaper publishing, DC Thomson, the biggest newspaper publisher still on Fleet Street. I've worked in service providers. Today I work in Dell, working in the Azure Stack product group, making Azure Stack HCI. For the last 7 years, I've been focused on the Azure hybrid space. I thought 7 years ago, when Azure Stack was first announced, that is the direction I want to go in. And in that time, I've been awarded the Microsoft MVP Award 5 times as well for my work in the community, talking about Azure Stack HCI as well. If you want to tweet, then I am on the socials at Kenny Lowe on Twitter, so by all means, talk about the session if you want. But without further ado, let's talk about my team first, because I'm here presenting on behalf of Jaromir. Jaromir is one of those folks in my team. I have presented the wrong deck here, I have just realized, so I'm going to have to break out and switch to the correct deck. When I was preparing, I downloaded the deck and it cut off halfway through and it corrupted, so I downloaded it again. This is the correct one. Here is the team. So while it comes up, this is a global team, and we are focused on basically being the field-facing arm of the Azure Stack product group at Dell. This is a team of real community experts and evangelists, people who know the product extremely well. In the Americas, we have Michael Wells and Matt McSpirit. Matt was formerly at Microsoft, has been the face of Microsoft Hybrid Cloud for many years now, on Microsoft Mechanics and other things there. He has joined us recently. In EMEA, we have Lisa Clark, Jaromir Kaspar, who sadly can't be here, and myself. All 3 of us Microsoft MVPs. And then in India, we have Jayant and Samir, who runs Experts Live India as well, so very deep community focus there as well. All of us really embedded into the Microsoft Hybrid community, and all of us here to really help people understand why Microsoft Hybrid Cloud. And before we can talk about why Microsoft Hybrid Cloud, we have to think about what is Azure. Where is Azure? Azure is, well, there are over 70 Azure data center regions now. That's more than AWS and Google combined. They span the globe. But these are very specific fixed in-point locations. And there are many reasons why people cannot move their workloads into a Microsoft data center. And note that I'm saying into a Microsoft data center, not into Azure. Because Azure, as a concept, as a platform, is phenomenal. I am an Azure MVP. I love Azure. Logging into the Azure portal, managing my workloads in there, deploying specific services, working with Logic Apps and Azure SQL and Azure Functions and Azure App Service and all these things. These are the ways that I get things done. And up until not too distant future, not distant past, the only way to do that has been within the context of a Microsoft data center. So you've had to go to a Microsoft data center to deploy your workload in there to take advantage of specific features. And it's those features that people love, it's not the location. And so I want to first of all decouple in your mind the concept of Azure being a location, Azure being a Microsoft data center, to be Azure being a concept, a platform, a thing that you use to get something done. And that really is the goal of Microsoft now for the past 7 years now. It's been to decouple Azure from Azure. To not just think, if you want to use the cloud, you go into a Microsoft data center. No, it's if you want to use the cloud, it's where do you want to use the cloud? And that's the way to think about it. And Azure as a control plane is a really powerful concept. Actually, there is no concept of enterprise control plane as an IDC category. I think there should be. So when you go into IDC, you should be able to say who are the leaders in control plane as a service. And I think Azure would be an absolute leader in there. Log into the Azure portal and manage your workloads anywhere. And through Azure Arc, you can manage workloads basically anywhere. But Azure Stack HCI is really the extension of Azure into the on-premises data center. It's the concept of, I want to use Azure and I can use the Azure portal, but I need to run my workload somewhere that isn't a Microsoft data center. How do I deploy that infrastructure? So Azure Stack HCI is an on-premises infrastructure, but it's designed to be Azure hybrid by design. Designed to be by design, as it were. So yes, it is an Azure service. So when you log into the Azure portal, you will see Azure Stack HCI as a first-class citizen in the Azure portal. Yes, you can manage your Azure Stack HCI workloads in the Azure portal as well. And yes, we're starting to get some of those rich, deep, interesting Azure services running inside Azure Stack HCI as well. So this is not just an IaaS play. This is not just running virtual machines. This is when you want to run things like, again, well, actually every single one of the things that I mentioned earlier, plus more. So Azure Logic Apps and Azure SQL managed instances and Azure Postgres and the app service and functions and Azure Kubernetes service and a whole load more coming to Azure Stack HCI and Azure Virtual Desktop as well, which I'll touch on in a bit, which is pretty awesome. But all of this designed to run where you want it. So same services, same experience, where you want to run it. And one of the interesting things that Azure Stack HCI unlocks is actually not just the location, but actually a price performance conversation as well. Because when you go into the Azure portal and you go and deploy some services, it's incredibly easy. It's also incredibly easy to spend huge amounts of money. And I don't know, let's have a look. We can do this. We can go to the Azure cost calculator and have a look and see. Oh dear, this is extended, not duplicated. There we go. Azure cost calculator. Because when you want to have high performance workloads, that's where cost starts to ramp up. If you want to log in there and start using some past services like Azure Functions and Logic Apps and things like that, that can be an incredible cost saver. In fact, I run a number of Azure Functions. I run URL shortener within Azure, running in Azure Functions, and it costs me absolutely zero. If I wanted to run that same URL shortener on premises, I'd have to have infrastructure, I'd have to manage it, I'd have to feed in water with power and cooling and the data center and so on there. Azure Functions lets me do that for free. Fantastic, one of the wonderful ways to use Azure. If I want to run a high performance SQL database workload, and I want to run that in native SQL, so I want to deploy a VM, deploy SQL 2022, and I want to run that as high performance as I can, ridiculously high performance, that is going to cost. And it's not just going to cost from a VM perspective, it's going to cost from a storage perspective as well. So let's just have a quick look, because it's always worth actually seeing what does Azure say about this. So if we add a storage account, and let's just say ECS, fine, that's one of the cheapest ones. Let's take some managed disks. Let's go for Ultra because we want to have fast performance. And let's say 8 terabytes, that's not a vast amount of storage, but let's go with that. Then how much is that going to cost for 8,000 IOPS? That's nothing, by the way, 8,000 IOPS. What's the maximum you can have? You can have 160,000. Okay, let's do that. That's the maximum. You're looking at $9,000 a month. $9,000 a month just for the storage. What if I told you that, well, let's calculate this. What if I told you could have Azure Stack HCI running on premises, delivering Azure SQL, so the same Azure SQL managed instances, for a fraction of that. So for 1 million IOPS, we'll say, so we got 160,000 there on our 8 terabytes. For 1 million IOPS, we're talking probably a 3-node cluster at $10,000 per node. So that is 30,000 for the cluster. That's going to run over probably 3 years. Wait, that's just the cost of it. That's it, you're 30K there. You're worth $9,000 a month just for storage and for about a tenth of the performance. When you're talking cost performance, on-premises wins every time. The reason the cloud has won in the past is because of features and capabilities and things that you don't get on-premises. Azure SQL Managed Instances give you some phenomenal features. The scalability, being able to scale up Azure SQL Managed Instances just with the click of a button, having built-in backup, disaster recovery, auto-recovery in case of failure. Well, all those things exist in Azure Stack HCI. It's the same service. So the argument for using Azure SQL Managed Instances in, I can't even say it, MI in Azure versus Azure Stack HCI is not a capability perspective. It can only be a cost-benefit perspective. And the performance you can get in Azure Stack HCI is just literally mind-blowing. The one that I've put up here, the 30,000 for a 3-node cluster, that is about as small as it gets. So that is not thinking, oh, let's have about the biggest Azure Stack HCI cluster we can have. That is saying, what is the minimum? That would be our AX6515s, which are about yay big, literally. That's our smallest one. They're single socket systems, just a few SSDs in each, 3 nodes, well over 1 million IOPS there. Ridiculous. We can do 16 nodes with vast amounts more disks, scale into the many, many, many millions of IOPS there in ways that Azure just can't. So when you're talking cost performance, high performance workloads, there's just no argument here. And it's not that we're competing as well. This is an extension of Azure. This is something that Microsoft has created to solve a problem. So you always want to look at, when you're deploying a workload, what is the right place to do it? Where should I be doing it? And what am I trying to get out of it? Don't try and hit the square peg into the round hole. Azure is wonderful at many, many, many things. At being a cheap platform or low-cost platform for running high-performance workloads, it is not. And Azure Stack HCI is there to fill that gap. Azure Stack HCI is designed to be familiar. So if you know how to run things in Azure, you should know how to run things in Azure Stack HCI. If you know PowerShell, you'll have a blast with Azure Stack HCI. If you know Windows Admin Center, that is your core management plane for Azure Stack HCI as well. And from an architectural perspective, this is kind of how it looks. I like this diagram here because actually it breaks out the cost elements as well. And it's always worth thinking about what are the different cost elements within an architectural platform that you're choosing to use and how is it delivered. So at the bottom, you have your hardware. This is bought from an OEM, your OEM vendor of choice. If you go to aka.ms/Azure Stack HCI catalog, then you will see all the vendors available, aka.ms/Azure Stack HCI catalog. Then you get a list of all the vendors who are delivering Azure Stack HCI. There are 2 different ways they can do that. They can say, yeah, our hardware will probably work, or they say, we have tested and validated this and we definitely know this works. These are split out into 2 categories within the catalog here. There are validated nodes, which is, it'll probably work, and integrated systems, which is, we have tested, validated this, we have a joint support motion with Microsoft, we are doing everything we can to make sure that this will work into the future. And today that is Lenovo, DataOn, Dell Technologies, and HPE have just entered this as well with their GreenLake offering there only. So there are a few options within there, but Microsoft do specifically recommend that you use these integrated systems to run Azure Stack HCI, and you don't try and just DIY it. When you go to Azure, you're not DIYing anything. You are taking Microsoft's hardware that they have said, this is the right way to do this. We have deployed this, we're managing this, and we're delivering you a service on top. The integrated system is kind of the way we're doing that on premise as well. We're saying, this is the right way to do it. We'll take care of this. Deploy it, we'll make sure it keeps running over time, and then you deploy your workloads on top. It's the Azure ethos on premises there. So do not try and DIY things, is my first piece of advice here. On top of that, we have the Azure Stack HCI operating system. The Azure Stack HCI operating system is the OS which runs Azure Stack HCI, as you might have guessed. Previously, to run Hyper-V in Storage Spaces Direct, you would have had to install Windows Server and then enable the Hyper-V role, enable the Storage Spaces Direct role, things like that. The Azure Stack HCI operating system is basically a fork of Windows Server, which splits off and has gone down its own path, basically to decouple from the Windows Server release cycle. So that in order to bring new innovation and new features to Azure Stack HCI, we don't need to wait for a new version of Windows. And the team making Azure Stack HCI don't need to worry about breaking Windows as well when they do it. So instead of waiting for 3 years to get new features, now we'll have multiple features per year with Azure Stack HCI. Think of the Azure Stack HCI operating system as the ESXi of Hyper-V. It is a dedicated OS specifically for running Azure Stack HCI. So you have your Azure Stack HCI operating system there, and so far your cost has been buying the hardware, and the Azure Stack HCI operating system is licensed at $10 or your local equivalent per physical core per month. And that unlocks every feature to run the Azure Stack HCI infrastructure there. So that unlocks unlimited use of software-defined storage, unlimited use of software-defined networking. It unlocks Windows Admin Center for management there. Basically everything you need to run Azure Stack HCI is unlocked at that $10 per physical core per month. That is very easy to plan for and understand what you're getting for your money there as well. Now, like every on-premises infrastructure, once you have the infrastructure up and running, you choose what workloads you want to run on top of it. So if you wanted to run just, for example, Linux virtual machines, that may be your entire cost basis. You may only have the hardware and the Azure Stack HCI operating system, and then run some Linux VMs, and there is no cost for them unless you choose to take out a RHEL support contract or something like that. If you choose to run Windows virtual machines on top of there, then you have a few choices. You can run them, you can license them traditionally. So you could buy Windows Server Standard or Data Center licenses there. You can also pay through an Azure subscription for your Windows Server VMs and Azure Stack HCI as well. So you can license your Windows Server VMs through your Azure subscription and pay for them through that cost basis as well, which for many customers who are using Azure today and extending workloads on premises and are already paying through an Azure subscription, just using that same mechanism is extremely attractive. But it's not all about VMs. Now, I'm very passionate about VMs. I don't think that they have gone the way of the dodo. I think that they are absolutely vital to the vast majority of operations across the vast majority of companies today. But there are also lots of interesting PaaS services to talk about as well. So things like Azure Kubernetes service, the fastest growing service in the Azure public cloud today. Very important that we have that, and so we have AKS, Azure Kubernetes service, within Azure Stack HCI as well. That is licensed separately, but it's by virtual core of the worker nodes deployed. So you deploy your worker nodes, virtual cores that are charged through your Azure subscription, very easy to plan for and cost for there as well. But it's what AKS unlocks which is really interesting, because if you look at how Microsoft is deploying a lot of the services within Azure today, they are deploying these on top of AKS. AKS is the plane on which many of Microsoft's services are being deployed. So previously it would have been Service Fabric, now they're mostly using AKS. And because they're using AKS to deploy their own PaaS services in Azure, it's a very easy proposition to start deploying those into Azure Stack HCI as well. So if we want things like Azure Cognitive Services or Azure Data Services like Azure SQL Managed Instances or Azure Logic Apps, and I could go on and on and on again, these things can be deployed into AKS exactly as they would be into Azure Public, and then you get the same services. And actually we keep the control plane in public Azure. This is the concept of the control plane of the service there, and the workload runs exactly as it would in a Microsoft data center wherever you've deployed your Azure Stack HCI. And this is extremely liberating. It opens up a vast number of opportunities for many customers, not just because of regulatory compliance or data sovereignty or latency or connectivity, but also because sometimes it's just a lot more cost effective to run these things on premises as well. And that opens up the question then, this looks great, but how do I get started with it? How do I start playing with Azure Stack HCI? And I've got a long way around to get to the point of the talk here, which is how can I get playing with Azure Stack HCI today? And if you want to deploy a lab, well, typically it's not that easy, because you saw in the last slide there, you've got hardware to buy. I said about $10,000 per node there. The minimum size, by the way, is only one node, so you can deploy Azure Stack HCI on just one physical server, and that's the supported config. It's still 10 grand that most people don't have. Even if you want to scale that down, people aren't going to spend £1,000 or whatever on deploying a lab, so it's expensive. Then there are infrastructure dependencies as well. So to deploy Azure Stack HCI, you need domain controllers, and you need NTP, and you need Active Directory, and all sorts of things that you need to be able to deploy as well. And it takes time. It takes time and effort, and people want to get started. One of the wonderful things about Azure is that you can just log into the portal and get started, get playing. It's an incredibly fast time to value conversation there. It's also extremely easy to spend in there, which is another conversation, but it's a very, very quick time to value thing there. And yeah, so in order to deploy Azure Stack HCI, you need a domain controller, DHCP, Windows Admin Center, management machines, potentially MDT, all sorts of different things that you need to have as supporting infrastructure to deploy Azure Stack HCI to get it up and running. And the process to deploy Azure Stack HCI is really you want to rack your servers and switches, deploy the OS, and go through manually a whole host of different steps to get it up and running. It is, I'm not going to say complex, but it is laborious. There is a lot to do in order to get it up and running. Now, there are deployment guides, there is extensive documentation on how to do it, but it is not extremely straightforward to do. Now, if Jaromir was here, he would say at this point, and that's why he decided to create MSLab. So when he was at Microsoft, and he's another of my Microsoft coaches, when he was at Microsoft, he created this GitHub repository called MSLab, which is really designed to take that time to value down to the bare minimum and make sure that you could test Azure Stack HCI within 20-30 minutes, if that's what you wanted, and not need to have expensive hardware to do it. In fact, what you need to run MSLab is a laptop. In fact, this laptop I'm running here just now is capable of running MSLab, running in a nested virtualization environment. Being able to test all the features at no cost on your laptop with full automation in the deployment process was the goal there. But it's still pretty complex, because in order to deploy MSLab, you need to have a decent understanding of PowerShell, you need to kind of know what you're doing, and you kind of need to be, well, let's say pretty technical to be able to go through it. So having moved to Dell, Jaromir has created some hands-on labs guides, which are built on top of MSLab, but make it much, much easier to get started and make it easy to get going really quickly. So these are lab guides of specifically how to explore Azure Stack HCI. They break down specific concepts and features and walk through end to end with all the documentation, screenshots, and everything that you need to deploy Azure Stack HCI and get going with it. In fact, if you have a laptop here right now and you have the Hyper-V role installed, then you could go to the GitHub repo for this, which I'll show you in a second, download the MSLab bits and get going within, well, by the end of this talk, you should have a lab up and running. Well, caveat there, you need to have the Windows Server ISO and an Azure Stack HCI ISO as well, so you have to download those. But as long as you have those, you can start now and be done by the end of this session and have Azure Stack HCI running in nested virtualization within your own laptop. And that's incredibly powerful. But we've not stopped there, because it's all well and good to deploy on your laptop, but that doesn't tell you the real world. So we've also extended this so that you can use these hands-on labs to deploy Azure Stack HCI in your laptop as virtual machines, or you can do it in a very simplified topology. So if you have one server or two servers, actually you can use MSLab to deploy those and get them up and running very, very quickly and easily. Or you can actually use it to deploy a full infrastructure. So if you have a 16-node Azure Stack HCI production cluster and you want to deploy that, then that is also possible using MSLab, and fully automated as well, end to end. So playing with MSLab in virtual machines is not a little sandbox, it is actually an on-ramp to how you would and could deploy and manage Azure Stack HCI in production as well. So I am going to break out of my slides now. The slides are a bit boring. And let's have a look at actually what is this GitHub repo, how do you get started with this. So if I go to github.com/delgeos/Azure Stack HOLs, so this is in the Dell Geos GitHub repository here. Can't zoom on that screen that well. So Dell Geos/Azure Stack hands-on labs. Basically, this is going to walk you through everything you need to do to get started with MSLab and Azure Stack HCI. So the first thing you need to do is go through the admin guides. Obviously, you start at step 1, and that is how you get going. But this is going to take you through how to basically deploy MSLab in the first place. So what you need, number 1, is something that supports Hyper-V. That is your first step. So any Windows 10 or 11 Pro laptop will support Hyper-V. So enable the Hyper-V role, reboot it, and you're good to go. You need to have 16 gigs of RAM. That is your minimum. You can go with a bit less, but if you actually want to test anything, 16 gigs, and then 100 gigs of free SSD. That's it. If you have those, you can get going with MSLab and you can start deploying Azure Stack HCI today. You could also deploy this as a VM inside Azure as well. That's going to cost a lot because you need to have a VM which supports nested virtualization. This is an EV3 or DV3 virtual machine. It's probably going to have, well, 16 plus gigs of RAM. You need to have SSDs in there, so it's ultra again. It costs. If you have a laptop, you can do it on there. That's all that you need. So the next thing you do, you need to download a few files. So first of all, you download the MSLab scripts, which is at this link here. I'm not going to click that because I've got them downloaded, but you download those MSLab scripts. Then you download the latest Windows Server ISO. I've downloaded the Windows Server 2022 ISO. It could be 2019 if you want. It's not going to make a difference here. It's just for creating a domain controller, it's management VMs, things like that. And then you download the latest Azure Stack HCI OS ISO as well. And with those, you can get going. So when you download the MSLab scripts, they come in a zip file. And they contain a few scripts. This is designed to be extremely straightforward. So these scripts are 1, 2, 3, cleanup and lab config. Now, hopefully it's fairly obvious what order we're going to do these things in, but let's zoom that up a bit. The most important file to start off with, though, is this lab config file, because the lab config is what defines what type of lab we're going to deploy. How many virtual machines are we going to deploy? Like, do we want a 3-node cluster, a 6-node cluster? Do we want to have it set up as a stretched cluster? What sort of features do we want to have installed? And these are all defined within the lab config file here. So this is all documented through the GitHub repo, but really the only thing you need to care about when doing this initial deployment is these two lines. Let's ignore the commented line here, but these two lines here. First one, which says what is your domain admin name, what password are you going to use, do you want to have a prefix on the virtual machines that are deployed, do you want internet access, that's basically that. How many virtual machines do you want to deploy? So 1.4 is going to deploy 4 virtual machines there, so 4 Azure Stack HCI hosts effectively in nested virtualization. And what is the name of the parent virtual hard disks that we're going to use to deploy this year? Now, what is a parent disk, I hear you ask? Well, that is one of those things that we're going to get deployed in just a second. So the first thing you're going to do is just right-click on prereqs, run with PowerShell. I'm not even opening it, I'm not even editing it, I'm just going to run this blankly, and say, run with PowerShell. It will automatically restart as an admin. That's going to go for UAC. I will click yes. And that is going to run through that script and basically make sure I've got all the prereqs that I need for MSLab to be deployed. So it's going to download some tools, it's going to download some DSC utilities, it's going to download everything it needs to do this full deployment, make sure that I have everything all lined up, good to go to actually do the deployment of my Azure Stack HCI nested virtualization cluster here. Now I'm going to minimize this because actually I don't need to wait for this to finish because I've already done it. But after that's finished and it says you're good to go, we're going to run the next one. And again, I'm not going to look at it. I don't need to look at it. This is designed to be rapid time to value. You can look at it if you want and look through what it's doing. It's going to create some parent disks, and the parent disk is basically a virtual hard disk that the other virtual machines will be created from. So rather than have a virtual hard drive for each different virtual machine, you have a parent one, then it basically diffs across the other ones as well. So it saves space on your machine when you're running this nested virtualization, so you don't need to have a huge amount of space. It's going to create parent disks for Windows Server 2022 for the Azure Stack HCI operating system, and it's going to create a domain controller, and it's going to install Active Directory on that, and it's going to create a domain, and then it's going to power that up as well. So it's going to create my Active Directory domain that I'm going to need to join my Azure Stack HCI to as well. After I've run my create parent disks script there, if I open up Hyper-V Manager, then this is what I am hopefully left with. There we go. So I've got my domain controller there. Now I've gone a step further there and I've run the next script, which is deploy. And deploy is going to take the config from the lab config file that we saw earlier, and then deploy an Azure Stack HCI infrastructure based on that lab config. But again, when I went to deploy this Azure Stack HCI infrastructure here, I just right-click, run with PowerShell. No editing, no looking through, no looking at what's going on. The only editing I've done is within the lab config here. And now I have an Azure Stack HCI infrastructure here, ready to use, ready to play with. And if I go back to the hands-on labs here, because this is built on MSLab, we have guides for a whole bunch of different scenarios here. So we can test out deploying Azure Stack HCI with Windows Admin Center. So you can walk through the end-to-end deployment process if you want from Windows Admin Center. So this lab config is going to deploy a Windows Admin Center box. It's going to deploy the necessary virtual machines to run Azure Stack HCI, but it's not going to configure them automatically for you. It's going to let you do that through Windows Admin Center and walk through the process if you were to do that yourself. There is a lab here for deploying Azure Stack HCI with PowerShell. That's effectively what that deploy script is doing just now. It is a full end-to-end deployment process for deploying Azure Stack HCI end-to-end with PowerShell for virtual machines, or it can be repurposed for hardware as well. You can use that for deploying Azure Stack HCI anywhere. We can explore the Openmanage extension for Windows Admin Center. This is a Dell-specific feature here. So Openmanage extension for Windows Admin Center allows you to basically manage everything from disks to cloud and everything in between from within Windows Admin Center. We don't want you to have different management planes for managing the hardware and managing your Azure Stack HCI. We want you to have one place to go, whether it's for doing CPU core management, for doing patch and update, which by the way is a one-click process which automates the full end-to-end update process, which is just awesome. But that's not why we're here. We're talking about automation, not Dell value. We can go through the Azure Virtual Desktop and Azure Stack HCI. So if you're interested in testing Azure Virtual Desktop and Azure Stack HCI, you can do that as well. Now, I hear you ask, what does AVD on Azure Stack HCI look like? Well, if I log into the Azure portal here, I actually have an Azure Stack HCI cluster, which is running AVD just now. So let's look at what the management experience for Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI looks like. If I log into the Azure portal here, and I go to Azure Virtual Desktop, this is how you do it in public Azure, by the way. You go to portal.azure.com, you go to Azure Virtual Desktop, and you start configuring your AVD services. So let's look, is there a separate Azure Stack HCI section here? Is there somewhere I need to look? Well, no, actually, it's just the same management experience. If I go to my host pools here, I have an MSLab AVD pool here, which looks exactly as it does if it's running in a Microsoft data center. The difference here is that all of these virtual machines, all of these AVD worker nodes here, effectively, are running in my Azure Stack HCI cluster in a lab in Austin. So it's the same, and it's not kind of the same, it's exactly the same. The only difference is where I've chosen to deploy those worker nodes there. So when I go to deploy my Azure Virtual Desktop, do I choose to deploy it into a Microsoft data center or into my own? Well, it's a choice. And why would I choose to do it into my own data center? Actually, we've seen through COVID, in particular, the ramp up of virtual desktops being needed by many, many companies, and we've seen the boundaries of what's possible from the public cloud being pushed to its limit. So latency is definitely a factor here. So having your AVD worker nodes as close to your users as possible, super important. Connectivity is important as well. There have been times where there are customers who just don't have that great connectivity to Azure, for example, but they do have good connectivity to their core network. And so being able to deploy within their core network and deliver that to the customers is super important. Cost is always a factor as well. If you want high performance, you're going to pay for that within Azure. And also, there are many customers that have lots of services running in their own premises just now, and having the virtual desktops close to the resources that they're accessing, super important as well. And those could just be file services, or they could be some other services that they're running within the bounds of their own data centers just now, and having this close to those, super important. But now there is no limiting factor in where you choose to deploy those. If you want to deploy AVD in a Microsoft data center, do it. If you want to deploy it in your data center, do it. If you want to deploy it in your basement, running on one single Azure Stack HCI node there, you can do that as well. It's your choice. And that really is the whole point of this decoupling of Azure from Azure. It's about not having to say, well, I love Azure, therefore I have to go to a Microsoft data center. It's saying, I love Azure, now where do I want to deploy my workloads? And so far we have, well, all the workloads that I've spoken about so far decoupled and able to run within Azure Stack HCI. That's only going to grow. And the ability to choose where you deploy those and when you want to run them is really the key defining feature in the Azure strategy as well. I think this is really borne out from the fact that Microsoft is not a born in the cloud company. Microsoft was born in the data center, Microsoft was born in the enterprise and grew out to Azure from there, and they maintain those links back to on-premises and they understand it well. If you look at AWS, you look at Google, born in the cloud companies trying to figure out how to come back on premises, it's a very, very different kettle of fish. Microsoft already has the relationships, capabilities, and has been building out these features and capabilities for the last 7+ years. Azure is hybrid by design, and I guess this kind of shows that is absolutely true, because if I had AVD application groups deployed in Azure, it would look exactly the same as this, and I would manage them in the exact same way, and I would go to the same place to manage them. There is literally no difference. If I go back to the core of the Azure portal here, and I click on, oh, this is nice and handy, I've got my AX6515 cluster here. AX6515 is an Azure Stack HCI model number from Dell, but this is an Azure Stack HCI cluster running in a lab in Austin, in Texas just now. It's a 4-node cluster, so we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 nodes there. If I want to manage that, I don't need to break out to a different portal to do that. I'm in portal.azure.com. I click on my Windows Admin Center here. I connect to my Azure Stack HCI cluster. This is where we need some elevator music. It initializes. I log in. And within portal.azure.com, I am able to manage everything that I need to do to manage the Azure Stack HCI cluster. So I can manage the virtual machines, I can deploy my VMs from within here, I can manage, if I had it deployed, AKS, I can manage the volumes, the drives, the software-defined networking, virtual switches, everything. And not yet, but soon, also the hardware under covers as well. So being able to log into portal.azure.com and manage the patch and update of the hardware is just a beautiful thing. Being able to have this one unified pane that you log into, and you can manage anything and everything across your entire infrastructure, and that infrastructure could be in Azure, in Azure Stack HCI. Some of it might be in AWS. You can do some Azure management of workloads in AWS as well through Azure Arc. But really, this concept of Azure as the control plane, where do you want to run the workload, is really I think one of the most exciting things going on in technology today, because it's no longer a choice of where you deploy, it's what you deploy. And if you've chosen Azure as your cloud platform of choice, then the world's your oyster. You can deploy where you want, when you want, and what you want as well. Now, before I round out, and I just want to run through a couple of the preview features here. So if we look down the left-hand side, we will also see the ability to manage virtual machines, virtual networks. Oops, I shouldn't click that. Virtual machines, virtual networks, and disks and VM images from within the Azure portal as well, without having to go into Windows Admin Center first. This is going to give us the ability to deploy VMs in Azure Stack HCI through ARM templates, to manage the deployment of what we do on premises to the same infrastructure as code constructs as we have in public Azure. So if you have a hybrid application and you want to make that an infrastructure as code, you can actually have one ARM template which deploys the Azure pieces, the Azure Stack HCI pieces, links them together, does everything from one IAC construct there. That's awesome. I mean, this is literally hybrid as hybrid should be and hybrid is meant to be. It is an ongoing journey, I'll say. We've been on this journey for almost 7 years now, building hybrid to be better and better and better. I would say it's never been, well, obviously it's never been further forward than it is now, but it's never been more production ready than it is now, I would say. So we have large companies, large organizations running Azure Stack HCI in production just now. Dell manages exabytes of data in public Azure. We manage many hundreds of petabytes of data on premises for Azure Stack HCI customers, and it is the extension of Azure on premises as well. So I'm just going to round out by saying thank you again to our sponsors. Without sponsors, we would not be here. So thank you Microsoft, HSO, Proximo 3, AIS, PwC, Docs 42. Thank you to Companion, CloudThing, Experian, Incremental, DQ Global, ATEC, Tiski, and Squared Up. I'm going to go and talk to them now out in the hall there and see what they've been up to. But thank you for your rapt attention. If you have any questions, I will be here all day. So please feel free to ask anything that you have. With that, thank you very much.